Hi everyone, welcome to week 8. This week we'll be discussing artography and having an introduction to some of the theories of this practice-based research and pedagogical process. And also we'll be thinking deeper into living inquiry by revisiting Karen Meyer's article on living inquiry and thinking with some of these concepts as we put the finishing touches on our living inquiry assignments. So again, this week we'll be reading the Karen Meyer's article, Living Inquiry, and also Spring A. Kind and Irwin's article, Artographers and Living Inquiry. We won't be working on a portfolio entry this week to give you more space and time to think about finishing up your living inquiry assignments. And so instead, you'll be posting a short response to the question, what does living inquiry require, to the week 8 Moodle forum. And there's a slide on that to come. So by Sunday at 11:55 p.m., participate in your group's 1-hour virtual collaboratory, and feel free to use this time to collaborate with each other as you put the finishing touches on your living inquiry assignments, and maybe layer some of these conversations with the readings as well. And then lastly, submit your living inquiry assignment in the Moodle Dropbox by Sunday at 11:55. So artography is a visual, artistic, and pedagogical form of research that is embodied, enacted. It uses creative methods, and it situates thought as in the making and in the doing. So in this way, thought emerges in the making of something. It's not existing separately, or it's not something that happens before or after an event, but rather it's made in moments with children and in processes of making. So artography attends to the intersections of art, research, and teaching as acts of inquiry in research and in pedagogy, where the arts are central in questioning, thinking, and in gathering meaning. So in this way, art is not in reference to a particular skill in drawing or painting or in other conventional images of traditional arts, but rather the arts are considered as acts of making, a way of thinking through something that is artful, otherwise experimental, propositional, where an engagement with a material or idea provokes us to think about something in a different way. So in the article this week, the authors talk about thinking in liminal spaces, where the outside is always the inside of another. So this idea kind of lets us think about what exists in the middle space between inside and outside, interior and exterior, self and other. And in this way, knowledge isn't situated at either end or in a linear line, but rather it exists in the middle of things, between ourselves as artists, researchers, and teachers as well, between methodology and pedagogy, between material and thought, where research aims to cultivate knowledge that grows in the middle of things. And this is sort of an act of complication, a complication of meaning that does not reside in one or other, but rather in between these spaces. So this requires conditions of thought that attend to relationality. Locations and situations are dependent upon multiple components and how they move in relation to each other. So it's not necessarily about you or me, but what happens between you and I in these relational spaces, between you, me, and material, and place, and all of these multiple components that come together. So this idea is similar to our conversations about photography and image, in that a thing or an image is never just the thing, but rather it's an event where multiple components move and come together in form and gesture towards something. So this thought breaks down the illusion that art, artists, and audience exist as separate or distinct. So this article draws on complexity theory, which considers that learning events do not exist in isolation, but rather in relation to and within a complex system of action and reaction, where there's no linear line between cause and effect, but rather that within these systems, multiple collisions happen where causes are in relation to and for each other, and that nothing exists outside of this relentless relationality within these systems. So in the article this week, it's written that artography is a methodology of relational aesthetics, where patterns exist not as predetermined identities, but as co-appearance, a being with one another. Meaning thus circulates, moving in all directions simultaneously. According to Nancy, this co-appearance is both unity and uniqueness, singular plural, the singular plural way of being. In other words, each individual identity is brought to being through encounters with other beings. It is the with that maintains both contiguity and the distinctiveness of each pattern. So this notion of relationality, thinking with this notion of relationality and understanding of relational aesthetics appreciates that meaning is made not from the inside out or from the outside in or from point A to point B, but rather meaning is made through encounters or interactions where we're not only unpacking something or deconstructing an idea, but in making and remaking with, something else is reconfigured and something else is made. Something is becoming here. So there's this is a connection, I think there's a connection here to phenomenology, where research is not something done to, but rather it's cultivated with, in the liminal spaces between inside and outside self and other material and theory. And I think that with is a very important word here, because with requires us to think in encounter with another, encounters that exist in between parts, not to subsume the difference of the other into the same, but to become affected by another, where capacity for movement is increased or decreased as we encounter something. So in this way, the arts, writing, photography, video, etc., are situated within the event. So it's very much a process that is living, and as Erwin Kind and Spring A write this week, it is intercorporeal, between bodies. So in this week's article, the authors also speak about stuttering, or an overlapping concept that I think speaks very well to last week's discussion of silence, where we encounter the unspeakable, ineffable, the inadequacy of spoken and written word, as is written on page 113 of the Van Manen text, where we're called to pause and reconfigure ourselves in relation to an encounter that exceeds our capacity of thought, and where, as Elizabeth Groth writes, where language eludes a preconceived vocabulary and we are forced to reconfigure, to inquire. So as teachers and researchers, if we're able to pay attention to consider and attend to an encounter where something is affected in this moment, something becomes a little bit more complicated, and perhaps we might respond to look for and assemble new patterns of meaning as we reconfigure ourselves in the midst of this encounter. And I think this is very much what artographers are looking for, is looking for these in-between spaces where our knowledge maybe hesitates, or where meaning is not yet known, and where new patterns of thought might emerge. So revisiting Karen Meyer's article from a few weeks ago, we can consider that living inquiry is a relationship between the text and theories you're engaging with, the topic of focus, and yourself as a writer, as a teacher, as an artist, and as a researcher. So in your inquiry assignment, you'll need to balance the phenomenon that you are inquiring with, the theory that's informing your lens, your topic, and your own writing toward an enlivened and poetic narrative of an experience that reflects these three components and how they work together. So these components are very much not separate, but they are cultivated in the moment of encounter. And as we've discussed, videos, photos, and text should work together purposefully in this way that highlight and enhance this moment of encounter that you're thinking with. So the ways in which this artistic composition comes together is very intentional, and the aspects of the method and content should work together. So Van Manen writes that phenomenological inquiry is not unlike an artistic endeavor, a creative attempt to somehow capture a certain phenomenon of life in a linguistic description that is both holistic and analytic, evocative and precise, unique and universal, powerful and sensitive. So thinking more about your inquiry assignments, your inquiry is driven by your initial question posed in your proposal, and furthermore, it's not aiming to answer wholly this question, but rather create more questions based on the one that you initially posed. So this is not a search for absolute truth. Also, as I said before, pay attention to the methods that you choose and that these methods are intentional, that the design and form of the work matters. So think of this as an artistic composition. In your inquiry, try to bring a sense of becoming. So present your inquiry in ways which speak to its movement, the movement of the topic as it's lived, that the themes and knowledge that you are sharing are not static, and that there's an essence of ambiguity and temporality here, knowing that we cannot tell exactly what it is that happened in its entirety, and knowing that you are not presenting others' opinions, finding out facts, or proposing how you think this topic ought to be lived, but rather your inquiry should be fueled by an attitude of questions, a search and research about how this topic is emerging, or rather with how this topic is emerging. So really consider this linguistic shift between thinking about and thinking with as you conceptualize this inquiry. So how it is lived in moments with others, and what this meaning might gesture toward, what themes might be nodding through the series of moments, and also thinking that these moments don't necessarily need to be big, but ordinary moments also have a lot to say. So noticing this requires a particular way of paying attention, and as we've discussed previously, it requires an art of noticing, an artful way of paying attention and thinking about a lived moment that's seemingly ordinary. Yes. So in week 3, we discussed living inquiry as a process. So in your living inquiry assignment, you will not present the phenomenon as a thing. So for example, this is a picture of my sister who is courageous because she did this. This is an example that I've given in a previous class as well, but rather in this example of courage, you would need to narrate a poetic description of how courage is lived in the world and gathers meaning as a transformative process that is living, that's nuanced and perhaps tension and imperfect. So it alludes to an openness and aspects of unknowability, and this is where this ambiguity comes in. So in this way, inquiry, I think, might be beautiful because of its complexity and perhaps because of its contradictions, not because it represents a common image of what courage is or should be. So we should not be presenting what we already know about courage, but rather thinking about the possibilities of what else, what if, as we come to know courage. So kind of situating this inquiry on the border of what we already know and what might be possible. So if you're able to show the movements and processes of courage in this example, I think this will offer a much more interesting narration with felt value over something that is static and wholly knowable.